Imagine waking up on a morning in 2025, in a world where the two bloodiest wars in human history, World War I and World War II, never happened. You might picture a thriving planet with glittering skyscrapers, flying cars zipping through the sky, and technology connecting people in an instant. But step outside, and the reality hits you like a plot twist in a sci-fi movie. It's a world full of paradoxes that leave you stunned. The global population has soared to 8.8 billion, a staggering figure, dwarfing the real-world estimate of 8 billion in 2022. Yet, the internet, which shapes our lives today, is stuck in its infancy, like the dial-up days of the early 2000s. No social media, no Amazon, no Zoom, no Netflix. Imagine that. Want to chat with a friend thousands of miles away? You're stuck writing letters or dialing a clunky landline that buzzes like an angry bee. In the US, vibrant cities like New York and Chicago are racing to build high-speed rail lines, something Japan mastered in the 1960s in our timeline. But here's the real shocker. Medicine has leaped forward in ways we can barely fathom. Hospitals in Boston and Los Angeles are using gene editing therapies to cure cancer and genetic diseases, a feat achieved since the early 2000s. This has pushed the average American lifespan to 80 years by 2025, compared to 78 years in our 2022 reality. Yet globally, the picture is starkly different. In remote regions of Africa and South Asia, hundreds of millions live in poverty, without clean water or modern healthcare. The British, French, and Dutch empires still hold sway, as if the colonial era never ended. Globally, 8.8 billion people are putting unprecedented pressure on resources. Rice fields in Vietnam and Thailand are exploited to exhaustion to feed this massive population. Grasslands in Africa are turning into deserts. Astonishingly, solar and wind energy, which took off in the 2000s in our world, have been the backbone of global power since the 1980s. This has slashed air pollution in cities like Los Angeles, making them cleaner than ever. But personal computers are just starting to appear in middle-class homes. Artificial intelligence, shaping our future today, remains a vague idea in research labs. Why does a war-free world lead to these paradoxes? Why is the internet, the symbol of connectivity, lagging behind? Why has medicine surged ahead, yet inequality widened? Why does a population boom come with massive environmental and resource challenges? These surprises aren't random. They stem from a chain of historical, social, and scientific events triggered by the absence of the two world wars. Want to know why these oddities happen? Join us in this detailed story, where we'll analyze the logic behind the population surge and the peculiar phenomena in a 2025 that's both familiar and alien, where history took a wildly different path. Population explosion. A more crowded world. Let's start with a jaw-dropping number. In 2025, the world's population hits 8.8 billion, 800 million more than the real-world estimate. To understand why, we need to rewind to the early 20th century, when the two world wars never happened. In reality, World War I claimed 20 million lives, including 10 million soldiers and 10 million civilians. World War II was even more devastating, with 70 to 85 million deaths, from battlefields to genocides, atomic bombs, and famines. That's a total of 90 to 105 million lives lost. In this fictional world, those people lived, and they reshaped the global population entirely. Picture millions of young men in the US, Germany, Russia, and Japan never marching to war. In the US, these young men return from fields and factories, start families, and have children. Assume each person has an average of 2.5 children, a common rate in the US and Europe in the early 20th century. These survivors create a new generation of tens of millions. Their descendants continue to reproduce over 3 to 4 generations, from 1914 to 2025, with a remarkable compounding effect. The result? The descendants of those 90 to 105 million survivors could number 400 to 600 million by 2025. In the US alone, the population grows by 30 to 50 million beyond the real-world 330 million, reaching 360 to 380 million. But it's not just the saved lives that fuel this population boom. The absence of war brings unprecedented economic and social stability. In the US, there's no Great Depression, the crippling economic crisis of 1929 to 1939. which was rooted in the aftermath of World War I. Instead, the American economy grows steadily from the 1920s, with factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh humming non-stop. American families, free from the specter of financial ruin or wartime loss, confidently marry earlier and have more children. From 1920 to 1950, each American woman might have 3 to 4 children, compared to 2 to 3 in our reality, where war and crisis curbed birth rates. Globally, the story is similar. In Germany, untouched by the devastation of 2 wars, cities like Berlin and Munich become industrial hubs, attracting millions of young people to start families. Russia, spared the 1917 revolution and civil war following World War I, maintained steady population growth, uninterrupted by famine or conflict. Japan, free from the atomic bombs and destruction of World War II, keeps a youthful workforce, with higher birth rates in the 1940s to 1960s. Overall, birth rates in Europe and Asia could rise 10 to 20% above our reality, adding 100 to 200 million people to the global population. Medicine also plays a massive role in this population surge. Without wars, countries like the US and Germany invest heavily in public health from the 1920s. Antibiotics like penicillin, rolled out widely in the 1940s in our world due to World War II, could be developed earlier in the 1930s. This reduces death rates from infections significantly. Vaccines for diseases like polio and measles, introduced in the 1950s in our timeline, could emerge in the 1940s, saving millions of children. In the US, public hygiene and nutrition programs are widely implemented. These cut infant mortality from 100 per 1,000 births in the 1910s to 50 per 1,000 by the 1930s, 2 decades ahead of our reality. As a result, American life expectancy soars from 55 years in the 1920s to 70 years by the 1950s, and hits 80 years by 2025. Globally, these medical advances add 50 to 100 million people, especially in developed nations like the US, UK, and Germany. However, not every region benefits equally from this population boom. Without World War I to topple the British, French, and Dutch empires, colonial regions like Africa and South Asia remain tightly controlled. These imperial powers prioritize resource extraction over investing in healthcare and education for local populations. In places like Nigeria and India, infant mortality stays high, at 100 to 150 per 1,000 births in the 1950s, slowing population growth. This lack of investment could reduce the global population by 50 to 100 million compared to its potential. Still, when you tally up all factors, saved lives, economic stability, medical advances, and colonial constraints, the global population in 2025 reaches a stunning 8.5 to 8.8 billion. The US contributes 360 to 380 million to this total, a nation transformed by peace and prosperity. Special phenomena, a world that is both progressive and backward. Beyond the population boom, the war-free world of 2025 witnesses peculiar phenomena, both astonishing and paradoxical. One of the biggest surprises is the delayed development of the internet, which in our reality shaped lives from the 1990s. In this world, by 2025, the internet is in its infancy, similar to the early 2000s to 2010s in our timeline. There are no social media platforms, no Amazon, no Google, and no modern web applications. Americans still rely on landline phones or handwritten letters for communication. Universities like Harvard and MIT are just beginning to deploy internal networks, akin to rudimentary LAN systems. Globally, countries like Vietnam and India are largely unaware of the internet, slowing the spread of information and international trade. Why is the internet so far behind? The answer lies in its military origins. In reality, the internet stemmed from ARPANET, a US Department of Defense project in the 1960s, driven by the Cold War, a ripple effect of the 2 world wars. Without WWI and WWII, the Cold War may not have occurred, or at least lacked the intensity to push the US to heavily invest in military computer networks. The TCP/IP protocol, the internet's backbone, developed in the 1970s in our world, might only emerge in the 1980s or 1990s in this scenario. Moreover, digital computers, like ENIAC in 1945, were spurred by wartime needs such as calculating artillery trajectories. Without war, computer research progresses more slowly. with personal computers only becoming common in the 1990s to 2000s. The prolonged colonial empires also slow globalization, reducing the need for cross-border connectivity. As a result, the internet only begins to commercialize in the 2000s to 2010s, leaving the 2025 world without the digital connectivity we take for granted. While the internet lags, medicine achieves staggering advances, creating a striking paradox. In the US, hospitals in New York and Boston use gene editing therapies, similar to CRISPR, to cure lung cancer, diabetes, and heart disease since the 2000s. This pushes the average American lifespan to 80 years by 2025, with 30% of the population over 65 living healthy and active lives. This stems from the absence of war, allowing the US and Germany to lead biological research from the 1920s to 1930s. Understanding of DNA structure, discovered in 1953 in our reality, could be achieved in the 1940s in this world. The Human Genome Project, started in 1990 and completed in 2003 in our world, could begin in the 1970s and finish in the 1990s, ushering in personalized medicine. The 8.8 billion population puts immense pressure on healthcare systems, driving research into curing chronic and genetic diseases. However, in the US, high medical costs mean only the middle class and above benefit, widening inequality. Globally, the contrast is even sharper. In Europe, personalized medicine is widespread, but in colonies like Africa, lack of investment leaves diseases like malaria and tuberculosis rampant, with average lifespans of only 55-60 years. Another striking phenomenon is the lead in green technology paired with resource depletion. By 2025, solar and wind energy account for 50% of global power, 20 years ahead of our reality, where these technologies surged in the 2000s. In the US, California and Texas are renewable energy hubs, with 70% of households using solar or wind power. Major cities like Los Angeles see significantly reduced air pollution, creating cleaner living spaces. This happens because the 8.8 billion population exerts massive pressure on food and energy, forcing nations like the US and Europe to invest in green tech from the 1970s to 1980s. However, prolonged colonial empires lead to overexploitation of resources in Africa and South Asia. Rice fields in Vietnam and Thailand are abused to exhaustion. Grasslands in Nigeria and Kenya turn to wasteland. Rising food demand forces the US to import crops from South America, driving up food prices. Globally, environmental agreements like the Paris Agreement of 2015 in our world emerge in the 1980s but fail to halt degradation in colonies. Industrialization also unfolds uniquely. In the US, high-speed rail lines connecting New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles are built from the 1950s, reducing reliance on cars and creating efficient public transit. Rural areas are fully electrified by the 1940s, 20 years ahead of our reality. Globally, Europe and Japan also develop high-speed rail networks from the 1950s, bringing prosperity to cities like Paris and Tokyo. Economic stability from no wars allows nations to invest heavily in infrastructure from the 1920s to 1930s. However, advanced technologies like artificial intelligence and nuclear energy lag behind. In our reality, these were driven by wartime research, like the Manhattan Project during World War II. Without war, nuclear energy might only appear in the 2030s to 2040s, and AI remains theoretical in 2025. Still, science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM education, thrives due to a large youthful population and social stability, producing millions of engineers and scientists. This lays the foundation for a technological revolution by the late 21st century. Finally, a notable phenomenon is the rise in social and geopolitical inequality. A peaceful world should bring fairness, but the reality is the opposite. Without World War I to dismantle empires, Britain, France, and the Netherlands control Africa and South Asia into the 2000s. These powers prioritize resource extraction, neglecting healthcare, education, and infrastructure for local populations. In Nigeria, India, and Vietnam, hundreds of millions live below the poverty line, with lifespans 20 to 25 years shorter than in the US and Europe. In the US, economic prosperity since the 1920s makes it a superpower, but domestic inequality grows due to high medical costs and restrictive immigration policies from colonies. Civil rights movements like gender and racial equality progress slowly without post-war social shifts, such as women's new roles in the workforce. Globally, national liberation movements only surged from the 1990s, sparking localized conflicts in Africa and South Asia, though not on the scale of the world wars. This inequality creates a 2025 world where progress is concentrated in developed nations, while colonial regions are left behind. End of story. In 2025, the world without World War I and World War II is a place of contradictions. The population surges to 8.5 to 8.8 billion, with the US reaching 360 to 380 million, thanks to avoided casualties, economic stability, and medical advances. Americans live longer, travel by high-speed rail, and breathe cleaner air from renewable energy. But the internet is just starting. Artificial intelligence is a distant dream, and global inequality widens as colonies languish in poverty. Personalized medicine saves millions, but only in wealthy nations. Green technology leads, but resource depletion threatens the future. A peaceful world doesn't guarantee uniform prosperity, but creates a 2025 both progressive and challenging, where history has charted a wholly different course. As you close this story, you might wonder, does peace truly bring a better world or just a different one, with its own lights and shadows?